Yes, sir.
And is my voice audible?
You sound lovely.
Okay, that's good. All right, so welcome everybody. And today the topic is Microsoft Flow Expressions. My name is Reza Dorrani. As Eric mentioned, I am a principal consultant. I'm also the Power Platform Practice Technical Lead at Catapult Systems. I was awarded as the Microsoft Flow All-Star by the Microsoft Dynamic Communities team last year. I am also the founder and the user group leader of the Houston Power Apps and Flow user group. And finally, I was also awarded as the top contributor for both the Power Apps and the Microsoft Flow community forums. And I will touch base on the community forums later on after I finish my session. The agenda for today is going to be all around Microsoft Flow expressions. So the expectation would be for me to keep this extremely simple, but expressions start getting complex once you start building applications for real world scenarios. So the first set of demos would be very, very straightforward in terms of how expressions work, how can you use expressions, where can you use expressions, and so on and so forth. But as we progress through the session, and after I complete most of the expression related topics, then I will actually show you some real world scenarios of where expressions can truly be utilized and how it can add a lot more power to your Microsoft flows. So
Hey, Reza.
talking about, sorry,
Would you mind minimizing that window on the bottom right?
on the bottom right, sure, I'm just going to push this a little bit on the bottom. Is that better?
You should be able to minimize it.
I'm not getting that option for some reason.
In the upper right there, there's the little.
There you go. Actually, my
Perfect. Thank
screen
you.
is just a little bit shrink in the center when I presented this, but okay. All right, so the agenda for today, we're going to talk about what expressions are. We're going to talk about the anatomy of an expression. We're going to talk about the different types of expressions that are available in Microsoft Flow. Then we are going to see where can we use these expressions in a flow. And then related to expressions are, of course, the data types that are available in Flow and the different functions that are available as part of expressions. And once we get through all of this and through a lot of demos, we will also talk about the limitations of expressions and the best practices when utilizing expressions in Microsoft Flow. So let's start with what are expressions. Now, unfortunately, I cannot see all of you guys, so probably I would ask Eric to do this for me in the room, and maybe people on the call can just go off mute and let me know. Have you all ever created a Microsoft Flow? Like, what's the percentage of folks who've at least created one Microsoft Flow?
I mean, small group in the room. We've got 5 folks and 3 are raising their hands, so
Okay.
almost half.
Okay, almost
Quite a
half
bit.
have created. All right. And the of those half of people who've created a flow, how many of y'all have actually used an expression, knowingly or unknowingly? And as you can see the screenshot on the right, this is where you go to enter an expression in a Microsoft Flow. So has anyone ever worked with expressions?
Yeah, same group.
Okay, same group. So all the three have worked with expressions?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, all right. So what are expressions? Expressions are a set of functions in Microsoft Flow that you can use to perform a very specific set of actions. Okay. Some of the examples of these actions could be string manipulation, working with dates, converting data types, performing logical functions, mathematical calculations, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you want to perform any sort of operation that requires certain actions, very, very specific that you want to perform that is not available as part of the out of the box flow schema, you would have to go down the part of writing expressions to perform those specific actions. In this screenshot, as you can see on the left hand side, there are different types of expressions. There are string functions, there are collections, there are logical functions, and so on and so forth. Just as an example, if you see the first one under string functions, there is a concat expression, and it says it combines any number of strings together. So for example, if you have a requirement wherein you want to concatenate data and present it to the user, you can do so by directly using the expression syntax in Microsoft Flow called concat, which will help you to concatenate multiple strings together. So this is one example of using expressions in Microsoft Flow. So this is just a very simple slide explaining what expressions are. The next step is we're going to talk about the anatomy of an expression. Now, in this case, if you look at the screenshot or if you look at the sample expression that's presented on the screen, we are using another string function, which is called replace. And what replace does is it enables you to replace certain text from a string with a new text. So if you look at the sample data, replace is the name of the function. Okay. In that we have multiple parameters. The number of parameters for a function depends upon the expression that you're using. In case of the replace function, as an example, it expects three parameters. The first one being the text, the original text, the second part being the word that you want to replace, and the third param being the new word that you want to replace the old word with. So as an example, if I was to execute this expression in Microsoft Flow, we're going to replace the word old with the word new, and the output would be the new word. So if we break down the anatomy of an expression, and this is true for any expression that we use, it will always start with the name of the function. In this case, it is replace, and then the number of parameters depending upon the type of expression or function you are calling. So if you look at concatenation as an example, it says combines any number of strings together. That means the name of the function is concat, and then it can have n number of parameters, which will enable you to concat all the strings together. So that's a very simple explanation of the breakdown of what an expression truly is. The next one, we're going to talk about the different types of expressions in Microsoft Flow. So the first type of an expression is a basic expression, an expression which only contains one function with one or more parameters associated with it. One of the examples was the previous slide. We spoke about the replace function. So that's a classic example of a basic expression. Why? Because I'm using one function, which is called replace, in which I am passing different parameters. Another example, as you can see in the screenshot on the left-hand side, we are using the concat operation. We are concatenating the text today is with UTC now, which will provide you the current date and time in UTC format. So in this case, again, I'm using one function called concatenation, and I'm using multiple parameters associated with my concat function. So whenever we use one function, that's called a basic expression. That's the first type of expression that we are using here. The second type of expression is the advanced type of expressions. These expressions contain more than one function with obviously one or more parameters associated with it. So let's look at some examples of these. If you look at the two examples that I've provided here, the first one is concatenating today's date, and it is formatting it in a particular format, right? So if you look at the expression, it has two functions. Concat is the first function. Format date type is a second function. So basically, I'm using a function inside another function. And this can be a chain reaction. I can have multiple functions combined together in the same expression to perform a desired output. So in this case, where you use more than one functions, these are called as advanced expressions. So an example of this one would be the concat operation, which is the concat function. It can have multiple parameters. The first parameter is today is, and the second parameter, instead of hard coding text or putting UTC now, I am using another function to format the date and time, which is another function which has multiple parameters associated with it. The first one is the date, which is UTC now. And the second parameter is the format that you want to specify the date in. All of these, I have actual live examples, which I will do as part of my demo. But this is just a very brief introduction to expressions, what they are, the anatomy of an expression, what basic expressions are, and what advanced expressions are. Any questions so far from the group, to the people at the event, or to someone who's online? You feel free to mute and ask any questions so far if you have any.
Don't see any questions. Nope.
All right, I'll keep moving ahead. So next up, we get to demo for expressions, and we will start with the demo of basic expressions. So because there were a few folks who've never created a Microsoft flow, in this case, I have, as part of my demos, pre-created Microsoft flows. And Microsoft Flows is basically the business process automation tool, which is another service as part of the Office 365 suite of services. And the first demo around Microsoft Flow, specifically around expressions, I wanted to do is around those simple basic expressions that we saw as part of the examples that I provided. So in this case, I have a Microsoft flow that I created, and this flow is triggered manually. By manually, what we mean is this, I need to go in and take an action manually in Microsoft Flow to trigger this flow. Okay, so Microsoft Flow, because there were a few folks who've not worked with Flow before, has three components to it. Number one is the trigger of the flow, because there has to be something that defines the trigger for Microsoft Flow. And the next piece to Microsoft Flow is actions. And a flow has to have minimum one trigger. Well, you cannot have more than one trigger. You can only have one trigger for a flow, and you can have one or more actions associated with your flow. In this case, I have my trigger as a manual trigger, and I have 4 actions that I have defined as part of my Microsoft flow. So it's a very simple basic flow. Now, as part of my actions, as you can see, I have my first action, and in this action, I have it's a compose action in Microsoft Flow. And what is a compose action? So if I go to Flow and if I say compose, it's a data operation wherein I can actually provide input to it, and it will provide that as an output contained in this compose action. So it's a very, very simple action in Microsoft Flow. So all of these are compose actions. As you can see, the goal is not to store data. The goal here is just to present data and show you how expressions work. So the first action, which is called replace text, what I'm doing here, as you can see, the expression, I've written the expression right here so you guys can see it. I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit more so everything's clear for you guys. Using the replace function, wherein I am replacing the word or the string Reza Dorrani, that's my original string, and I want to replace the word Reza with the name Muhammad. Now, if I click on the replace function as an expression, this is the actual expression. And how do I know that this is an expression? You see the FX syntax that comes along with it. And I'll show you how I added this expression as well. So let's go ahead and actually do this. So I'm going to clear this up and recreate the expression. So in order for you to create an expression in Microsoft Flow, when you click on an action's properties, if you notice on the right hand side, it opens up a properties dialog, which gives you 2 options in Microsoft Flow. Now, for the folks who worked with Microsoft Flow would be very familiar with this, but for the ones who've not, if you notice, there are 2 options. One is dynamic content, and the second one is expression. Our topic today is all around expressions, but just to throw a little bit of light on what dynamic content is, it basically gives you access to properties of it gives you access to the properties of the actions prior to this step. So as you can see, right before this step, I have an action called manually trigger a flow. So based on that action, I get these set of properties that I can use. If I go to the next action in my flow, and if I look at the dynamic content that is presented to me, it will present to me the dynamic content from all the steps above it. So it is also giving me replace text output. Why? Because this action is placed before this particular action. So it's a chain reaction, and it gives you all the properties associated with the actions before this particular step. So heading back to our replace text action, in this case, I'm going to write an expression because I want to replace a simple text. So in this case, what we are going to do is we are going to go to expressions, Now there are multiple ways of typing the replace function. One, of course, if you already know that replace is a function, you can just directly type replace. And as you can see, as I am typing, IntelliSense is running at the back end. And if I click on this little information icon out here, this will give me more information about what this function does. And this is true for any function that you want to use in your expression. So this says it replaces a string with the given string. Now, if I open the function, again, IntelliSense is walking me through what is required. So as you can see, the first parameter has to be of type text. Has to be of type string, which is your base text. So in this case, I'm going to say, okay, my base text is Reza Dorrani. It's a hard-coded string. Next, if I put comma, it's asking me for another string parameter, which is the text that I want to replace. So I'm going to say, okay, I want to replace Reza. And I want to replace Reza with the new text, which the replaced word is going to be Muhammad. And I'm going to say, okay. And this is how I went ahead and created that same expression. Now, if I click on this, this will again show me the expression that I created, and I can modify this. Okay, I can update this and I can hit the update button and the new expression would come into effect. Now for this demo, what I've done is, because expressions, if you want to truly see the expression, you have to either hover on the function to see the expression, or you have to click on it to see the expression in the expression box. I have actually gone ahead and hard coded the expression text right here. So this is just plain text, but this will enable us to see the expression behind it. So that's the first expression. Sorry.
We have a question in the room.
Yes, please.
Does that replace that text everywhere in the list?
So the question here was, does that replace that text everywhere in your list? Can you give some
Yes.
context around that?
Yes, so the replace function would replace that word everywhere in the string. So if I had multiple Rezas, it would replace all the Rezas with the word Muhammad. It would do that.
So, Deirdre, you asked your question in the context of a SharePoint list, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, as you know, I'm hard coding text right here, but let's say if I was to fetch data from a SharePoint list and use it in...
Demonstrate how the expressions itself works.
Sure.
So he's basically saying, here's a string, and if I want to replace part of that with another piece, here's how it would work, right? Now, the input, he's hard coding as his own name. That input could come from a SharePoint list.
True.
Right. It depends on the trigger. So I think, do you have a more advanced demo of that?
Yes,
Reza?
I do have demos later on which talk about more advanced form of expressions. This is just giving you a taste of what a basic expression truly is. We're just talking about what the replace function does. But yes, right now I have hard coded this. If I wanted to replace this, I can easily do this. I can go to dynamic content, and let's say you are reading a SharePoint list item and you have a column that you want to change the data for. All you need to do is just pick that value and then put your replace command in front of it. So it's very simple, very straightforward in that sense.
Thank you.
I have demos later on which we'll go in depth into how these things work as well with respect to SharePoint and other data sources. Okay. All right. So this was the first expression that we've written, which is the replace function. Very simple, very straightforward. And I walked you through the process as well. And as you can see, IntelliSense truly guides you through how you can go ahead and use a particular function. Now, one option is I already know that replace exists, right? Another option is because it's a string operation or a string function that I'm performing. If you look at it, expressions are categorized as string, collection, logical, conversion, mathematical, and so on and so forth. There are different categories of expression functions. If I click see more on string, you see replace is right here. So if I want to see all the expressions that are available as part of Microsoft Flow today, all I need to do is open the expression window, pick the different categories of expressions, and I can see the list of all the string-based expressions that are available. Okay. All right. So this was the first example. The second thing that I wanted to also highlight, because we are using the replace function, is that replace is case sensitive by design. So in order to prove that point, I created two more expressions. The first one is going to replace the word old with the word new. Okay. And the second one is going to replace the word lowercase old with the word new. So when I actually execute this flow, you will notice that this expression continues to output the old word because the original text has O capitalized, whereas the word that I'm replacing has a lowercase o associated with it. So this is just a demo to show you that expressions, when you're using the replace function specifically, they are case sensitive by design. So you need to be aware of that. And how do I know about these things? How do I know expressions like, for example, replace is case sensitive? How do I know if replace is going to replace all the words in the text? All of that in my slide deck at the end, I have a link which links to the expression function list. It's on docs.microsoft.com. It talks about each and every function and each and every property associated with that function. But in this case, because I used replace as an example, I just wanted to highlight the fact that replace is case sensitive. Also, I have used another function out here. So this, as an example, what we are doing right here, these are basic expressions. Why? Because we're just using one function and we're using a set of parameters associated with it. In this case, I'm combining two functions together. And how am I doing this? If you look at my expression, in fact, if you look at it right here, I am using the function replace to replace this text. And again, I've written a second expression, which is to lower. And what to lower does, it basically converts the string to lower text. So what this will do is it will convert the old word. It will convert this text to lowercase first. And then when I use the replace function, it will replace the word old with the word new. And this will 100% work. Replace is case sensitive. That's why I'm changing this text to lower. Again, I'm using another expression, which is to lower. And just to prove my point, how do I write expressions related to lower? As you can see, the moment you type in to lower, if you look at the syntax, again, IntelliSense guides you through everything. It clearly says the string to convert to a lower casing. So all I need to do is provide it a string or maybe a value or maybe a dynamic content value that I fetched from SharePoint or Excel or OneDrive, whatever my data sources in my flow. And finally, another one, which was also a part of one of the sample examples that I provided in my presentation. We are using the concatenation function right here. And all I'm doing here in this expression is I'm concatenating the word today is with UTC now. Again, UTC now is technically a function which gives you the current date and time in UTC format. One thing you need to be very, very aware of is that Microsoft Flow only works in UTC time zone. So if I was to query SharePoint to fetch a date field, for example, that date field, when it would be returned to Microsoft Flow, it would be in UTC format only. If I want to change that and email, let's say I want to read the created date of an item, and maybe I want to send an email to my user who is in the Pacific Standard Time. In that case, you would have to use another expression function, which is convert time zone, to convert that date that you obtained from SharePoint, because it will come in UTC format, to the desired time zone of the user. So in that case, again, you need to use an expression. There is no other way to get this date to the user in the desired format. Now, in this case, I'm using simple concatenation that says today is UTC now. As you can see, I have two more concatenations which are not required, so we'll keep it really simple. So that's it. All I've done in this flow is I have a flow that I'm going to trigger manually. And in this, I have created 4 compose actions in which I have used multiple expressions. The goal of this flow is to only understand expressions. Now, in order for me to run this flow, all I need to do, because I have said I'm going to manually run this flow, I need to go to the flow and click on the run button and run this flow. And what this is going to do is this is going to execute the Microsoft flow. And once the flow is complete, I'm going to just refresh my screen. Every run that you make for this flow will be recorded in the runs section right here. So as you can see, I just ran this flow at 6:39 p.m. And if I click on this, this is going to give me all the details associated with the flow that just was executed. Now let's look at the different actions and let's look at the outputs. So the first one we used was replace text. And this is the formula that I used, right? The expression was Yes.
Sorry, quick question.
Yes.
So, I-
Sorry, Eric, I don't hear the question. You'll have to let me know.
1 second. I'll repeat it.
one of the questions I had is that with that converting like slower and then whole new is that if you're you're not familiar with it, that could go wrong, you know. So
Right. So let me repeat that. Reza, there's a little bit of an echo right now.
Sure.
Um, but the question was
Mhm.
related to 2013 on-prem workflows,
Okay.
logging activities to understand where things are going wrong or failing. And the ultimate question is logging and tracking and understanding failures in Flow easier than the SharePoint 2013 on-prem workflow? SharePoint Designer.
Right. So in SharePoint designer workflows, as you know, if the workflow would fail, it would just put it in the workflow history list that hey, the workflow has failed, unless you've done logging within the workflow wherein you're writing to the history list, right? In case of Microsoft Flow, if my flow run fails for a specific reason, as you can see, each and every run of my flow is tracked. So if I click on this and let's say for some reason my flow failed on this step, it will clearly provide me a visual indicator right here telling me that the flow has failed at this step. So you can always go back to your flow runs and look at the steps or look at the flows that have failed, and you can also go into the individual flows and look at where exactly they have failed. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Yeah, I think that was helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. So in this case, luckily our flow has passed. It had to because we've just written very simple expressions. And let's look at the let's look at the output of these expressions. So the first expression we used the replace function, wherein I replaced the text Reza Dorrani was my base text, and I wanted to replace the word Reza with the word Muhammad. And as you can see, this is the output that got presented to me, which is Muhammad Dorrani. So it did replace the text using the replace function. If we look at the second action, right, we use the expression replace again, wherein we are replacing the word old with the word new in this text. And if you remember, I said replace is case sensitive. So in this case, the case exactly matched. So it was able to replace the word and the output was the new word. In the second case, where I'm using the same expression, but because I'm trying to replace with the lowercase old and the O in the text is capitalized and replace is case sensitive, it did not replace it and it kept the original text as the output. Right? So this proves that replace is case sensitive. To further add, we also used then the toLower function, and this was the first example where we combined multiple expressions. So in this case, we used the word replace, wherein we said replace the word old with the word new, everything lowercase. If you look at the text, we again used another function called toLower, which converts any text that you provide as the parameter into lowercase. So that means it will first convert this to lowercase, which will give you the old word, everything lowercase, and then the lowercase word old will be replaced with the lowercase word new. And that is why, if you look at the output, it's the new word. So in this case, I've used multiple expressions to make sure that when I'm actually checking to see, or if I'm trying to replace a word, I can successfully do that. And finally, we also presented today's date, wherein we used a concatenation function, wherein we said today is UTC now. And as you can see, this is giving me the date and time for today in UTC format. It's showing the date as the 5th of September. I believe that's 1:39 at night. So I think we are like, how far away from UTC? I think 7 hours or so is what we are away from UTC based on the Pacific Standard Time. So it's giving you exactly the UTC time format. How we convert this, we look at the next we look at the next demo to see how we can convert this into our local time zone and present it to the user. All right. So I'm going to go back to flow. So that was the first demo. Again, a very simple, basic demo. The second one is around the formatting of the date. So let's look at this flow. Most of the flows that I'm going to demo today as part of the non-real world use cases is just going to explain what expressions are and how they work. So most of my flows are going to look like this, wherein they're going to be manually triggered, and I have compose actions to define my expressions. Now in this
Reza?
case, yes,
Sorry, one more question.
yes, please.
On the topic of failures, this is from Naveen in the chat.
Yes.
He's asking, is there an error logging mechanism in SharePoint to catch failures and log them?
So is there an error locking mechanism in SharePoint to capture errors in Flow? The answer to that is out of the box, no. But what you could do in Microsoft Flow is if there is an error, you can actually track that error in Microsoft Flow and then log it in a separate SharePoint list. So in a SharePoint designer workflows, as you can know, the name is SharePoint designer workflow. It's linked with SharePoint. Flow is not linked with SharePoint. What you do is you associate your SharePoint data source to a Microsoft Flow. So it's not going to do the error handling for you in SharePoint. It would do it in Flow. If you want to push that information over to a SharePoint history list, for example, you can do that using Microsoft Flow. But that's extra additional steps that you would have to take in your Flow in order to handle that.
Great. One more question.
Yes, please.
1 second.
So is there a way to build or log a link directly to the execution of that flow? For example, it's very common, like I would write to a separate link field, a link directly to the flow run itself, SharePoint workflow itself, so someone can quickly click on it and then see the actual execution of the flow. Is there a way to be able to do that with flows runtime to be able to pass a link to, and so if I clicked on it, it would take me directly to the flow, directly to that run that occurred?
So in order for you to directly go to that link and to directly go to that run, so every time your flow runs, if you notice, as part of expressions again, one of the expressions is called workflow. You see this? It says this function provides you details for the workflow itself. Now, if I click on this, this is again a function called workflow. Now, if I execute this flow, and we'll just add this and keep this right now. Again, this is not a part of the demo, but I'm just going to add it in here and we will look at this, what this provides. So it provides you details around, okay, this is the link to the flow and this is how it was executed and so on and so forth. So it gives you information of this flow run. Now, if you want to create a link that directly takes you to that flow, directly takes you to that run, you need to first know how is your flow being triggered. If your flow is being triggered from SharePoint, well, guess what? You can use the workflow action to get all those details, and then you would have to manually push all those details over to Microsoft or to your SharePoint list so that you have that information available for you. If I go back to my Microsoft flow, and if I look at a previous run, right, these are examples of my runs. If I click on this, if you notice, the URL is pretty much standard. It is flow.microsoft.com manage environments. This is a link to the environment wherein I'm creating my flows. This is always going to remain the same as long as you're building your flows on the same environment. Flows slash this ID is the unique ID of your Microsoft flow, which again, once you build a flow, a unique GUID gets associated with it. So this is not going to change. And this is the GUID again that is associated, or this is the number again that's randomly generated, that's associated with this run. So whenever you run your flow and if you use that workflow function, you can actually gather this information. The only catch here is all this work would have to be done manually by you in the Microsoft flow. It's not automatically going to pick up this information. It's not going to automatically going to dump this information into SharePoint. None of this is going to happen. You have to take all those steps. You have to take all those measures to ensure that these things are populated in SharePoint. So finally you get this link because this is the link that you need. And if I have this link and I can create this link, I can directly get to that flow, to that specific run. So there's work that needs to be done, but it is possible.
Thank you, Reza.
Sure. All right. So back to our flow, and this flow has executed. So we look at the executed flow in this case. And this is a very simple flow. I showed you this expression before. I'm just concatenating today's date with UTC now. So it's giving me today's date and time in UTC now format. If we look at the next expression that I'm using, I am using a function again, another function called format date time. And in this, you can format your date and time into any format you like, right? So in this case, I'm converting this to day, which is 3 Ds. That's why it's giving me Wednesday, the month, the day, the year, the hour, the minute, the time. So you can define the format that you want to output, because the default format is going to look like this. This might not be the format in which you want to present the data to the user. So this is the format in which it is presenting the data. And if you want to convert it to the local time zone, all what you need to do is again use another function called convert from UTC. You give the original date, which is the current running date, and you give the time zone that you want to convert this into. So in this case, it will convert it from UTC time to Pacific Standard Time. And if I was to just rerun this flow right now, you will notice that the final output for this is the current date and time right now, which is Wednesday, September 4th, 2019, 6:51 p.m. Why? Because this is the date and time in the converted time zone, which is the Pacific Standard Time. Very important to note, if you want to work with dates and times in Microsoft Flow, your only friend is expressions.
All right, we've got another question for you, Reza.
Yes.
So with Pacific Standard Time, I want a different time zone. I was using that string. Where would I find this? How this?
Eric, you'll have to repeat the question for me.
Sure. So the question is, you've got the string in the function there for
Yes.
Pacific Standard Time.
Right.
Where is that defined list of strings that are accepted there?
Great question. So again, in my presentation, when I get to the final link, which talks about all the functions, when you go to that docs.microsoft.com, and when you look at the function called convert from UTC, it has a list of all the time zones that you can pick from. And every time zone has its own specific string that is defined. So if I was to misspell this and if I was to run this flow, it would fail because it would not be able to find that specific time zone. So great question. Yes, you need to know what is the exact word that you need to put in as a string here in order for this function to convert this. And if you look at the expression in action right here, this is the live expression, convert from UTC. If you look at this, the first thing is the timestamp, which is UTC now, and the second thing is the time zone. And you see it says destination time zone string format. It requires a string. It has the link right here. So if I was to go to this link will actually list out all the time zones for you. Actually, I believe I went to the wrong, I copied the wrong URL. So here is the list of all the time zones that you can choose from. So for Pacific, I picked up the string right here and I copied the string and I pasted it into my Microsoft Flow. So very simple, very straightforward. IntelliSense will guide you through 99% of the cases in expressions. It will help you understand expressions and it will guide you through the process.
And if you don't get what you need from IntelliSense, then you find Reza on Twitter and start bugging him.
Not on Twitter, but on the community forum.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so that was around date formatting. And the final part is around usage. And before I get to usage, let's get back to the presentation deck. So the next part of the presentation is where can we use expressions, right? We saw what expressions are. We saw what functions are. Yes, there are various types of expressions, dates, maths, logical operations, string operations, so on and so forth. But where can I use these expressions in a Microsoft Flow? And somebody asked me a real world example of SharePoint, right? So in this example, and if you look at the sample example that's given over here, and for the folks who are new to Microsoft Flow, there is an action in Microsoft Flow which enables you to read data from SharePoint. And for example, here's the action called get items that I'm using. And all I'm doing here is I'm connecting to my SharePoint site. The first attribute or the parameter that it's expecting is the site address. Then it's expecting the name of the list. And then I'm filtering the data from the list. If you notice in this case, it's an action. It's an action in Microsoft Flow. In this action, I am using an expression called add days, right? Why am I doing this? If you notice my expression, I've also pasted the expression at the bottom. The add days is a function in Microsoft Flow again as an expression, which will enable you to add days to a date time. So maybe I want to get a list of all the regions where the activity date is greater than or equal to 7 days from 7 days before today. That means there is some activity performed in this list in this date field in the last 7 days. Okay. And why last 7 days? Because I'm using -7. If I was to use just the number 7, it would add 7 days. If I was to put a if I was to put a minus symbol right in front of the number, it will actually subtract the days. So there is no function in Flow which says subtract days. There's just an add days function, and you can subtract it by just putting a negative symbol in front of the integer number. And we'll look at this expression live in action as well. But this is one example of where you can use expression. So I'm using expression in a Microsoft Flow action right here. So that's one place where I can use expressions. Second place where I can use expressions is conditions. So in Microsoft Flow, you can define conditions as well. So you don't have to just connect to data, right? You don't have to create an action which says get me data from SharePoint or get me data from OneDrive or Excel. But once you get the data, you will probably perform some conditional logic as part of your Microsoft Flow. So if you create conditions in Flow, even here, expressions can be your friend. Right? So if you look at this condition expression right here that I'm using, I have an expression called length, which is again a function in Microsoft Flow, which gives you the length of an array or the length of a string, right? The number of characters in a string. In this case, I am saying give me the length of the items that has been returned by the SharePoint action of get items. So it's giving me the length, and I'm checking to see if that length is greater than 1 or not. That's a very simple condition I've written. I will demo this, so don't get confused as to what that expression is doing. But the idea behind these two slides is to explain to you where you can use expressions. So you can use expressions literally anywhere in your Microsoft Flow. Okay, so you can use it in your actions, you can use it in your conditions, and I don't have it as part of my slide deck, but very recently, very recently, you can actually define expressions even in triggers. So if you notice, the first thing in my Microsoft Flow was a trigger. I can actually define an expression there also now, and I'll show you how we use it today. Before we go to the demos and I show you how that's used, one very important concept to understand in Microsoft Flow are data types, right? If you notice the concat operation I used, I'm concatenating strings. That means I have to use a string, right? It has to be a string. It cannot be a number. I cannot concatenate a number to a string. It's going to throw an error when I create that expression. So it's very important to understand what are the different data types that are available as part of Microsoft Flow, because these are going to be used in expression, right? So we have string, which are your regular strings, which are letters, numbers, spaces, symbols. Any string that you're hard coding would have the apostrophes around it, or the single quotes around it, sorry. Integers are your whole numbers without decimals, of course. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be zero. This is an example of an integer right here. When I'm doing add days, I'm adding 7 days or I'm subtracting 7 days to my flow. That number in this case is an integer. I can also have floating point numbers in flow. I can have booleans, which are true or false. I can have arrays, which is one of the most key aspects of flow, which is your collection of data. And finally, you can have forms, which I will also talk about later in my session. So you need to be aware of these data types. These are the different types of data that you can come across during your Microsoft Flow creation process. And then the next part, which is something that we saw as part of the demo as well, were the different functions that are available as part of expressions. There are string functions, replace, concatenate, to lower, to upper are some examples. Collection functions. Collection functions are functions that deal with arrays or collections. For example, is this collection empty? Give me the first value of the collection. Give me the last value of the collection. Intersect two collections together. Do a union of two collections. The next one is logical functions. These are your if conditions. your AND conditions, your OR conditions. You want to check if this collection equals this collection. You can use logical functions.
Reza,
Yes, please.
got another question for you.
Yes, please.
Are you able to do regular expressions in Flow yet?
Are you able to do regex expressions in Microsoft Flow yet? Good question. I would like to stick my neck out and say no. Based on my understanding of the system, right, I don't think you can write regular expressions yet. You can use the combination of expressions to create a kind of a regular expression, but I don't believe there is any function yet that gives you a regex kind of an experience. And I'm just checking actually as I talk to you. No, there is none yet.
And you have to check. You have to check day to day because they change it all the time.
Because we are working in the Office 365 world here. Information keeps changing on a day-to-day basis, and if something new is pushed out as part of the expression suite, again, this is very important, right? You need to be up to date with what's coming. That's why following Microsoft Flow docs.microsoft.com, the community forums, the Microsoft Flow product team is going to give you a lot of insights into what's coming as part of expressions in future. But as of now, there is no regex function that you can use. Conversion function. Sorry, I hope I was able to answer that question.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. The next set or the next type of functions are conversion functions where you can convert data types. So maybe I have an integer, I want to convert that to a string. I have a Boolean, I want to convert that into an integer. I'm sorry, I want to convert that into a string. I can do things like that using the conversion functions. There are math functions, reference functions, datetime functions, workflow functions, manipulation functions, a lot of things that help you deal with the data types that are returned as part of Microsoft Flow actions. You can even work with XML data and JSON objects using Microsoft Flow. And most of my real world demos would cover those JSON object case scenarios. So there are different types of functions that you need to be available of, or you need to be aware of. And how do I know about these? I kind of did this before, but if you go to expression, right here are all the different types, right? String, collection, logical. So how many logical functions do we have today? If I go to see more, this is the complete list of logical functions that I can execute today. And this list keeps on growing. So it's very, very important to stay updated and be aware of what's new, what's changing, what's getting deprecated, so on and so forth. And finally, back to demos. Right, back to Microsoft Flow. Now we spoke about usage, that you can use a Microsoft Flow in a condition, you can use a Microsoft Flow in an action, right? Let's look at that in a live demo. So in this case, I have a flow that's triggered manually. That's my trigger point. And I have an action that queries a SharePoint list. Now, before I show you what this query is doing, let's go to the SharePoint list, right? I have this list in the site called regions. So I go to the list / regions. This should take me to that SharePoint list. Okay, so I have a list of regions and I have a title column. I have a people picker column of type admin, and I have something called as last activity date, which is the date time field. Now, if I go back to my Microsoft Flow, if you notice, the query that I'm performing, the filter query operation, is activity date is greater than or equal to, and I'm writing an expression. If we look at this expression, I am subtracting 7 days from today's date and time. If you notice, I'm using UTC now. Whereas if I go to SharePoint, now this system was set up in Central Time, so all these dates are showing up for me in Central Time. When you perform the query, as I mentioned, Microsoft Flow only deals with UTC time. When it actually queries SharePoint, these dates would be converted into UTC and the query will be performed. So you don't need to worry about that. You need to directly work with UTC in Microsoft Flow. So in this case, I am saying, give me all the regions from that region list in SharePoint where there has been some activity performed in the last 7 days. And I'm using the greater than or equal to operation. The expression that I'm using is called add days, wherein I'm adding or subtracting days depending upon the value that I'm providing here. If you look at the add days function, I'm going to try and zoom a little bit out because this got too big. Let's click in again and let's try add days again. So if you look at the add days function right here, the first attribute is a string that contains the time. So this is UTC now. And if you look at the second attribute, it's the number of days to add. It can be negative to subtract days. Once again, IntelliSense is guiding me through the process. So that's my query. I'm saying get me all the items from the SharePoint list where there is some activity performed in the last 7 days. Now, if I go to the SharePoint list, of course, yes, please.
You do the filter action. Is it if you have a large list that's like, so your result can come back that's over 5,000 items? Is that
great question? If I have a Microsoft, if I have a SharePoint list that is beyond 5,000 items, now, as you know, if I go to SharePoint itself, so let's say my SharePoint list was beyond 5,000 items, I can perform the query right here as well, right? I can say filter by this date. If my list was beyond 5,000 items, even this query would fail. And the recommendation is in SharePoint, again, this is related to SharePoint. This is not related to Microsoft Flow. So in SharePoint, if your list is extending 5,000 and if you're performing operations on columns that you are aware of. Now, in this case, I know that I'm going to query the activity date column. So what I can do is I can go to the settings of my list. And in this case, there's something called as indexed columns. Indexing basically gives you the power to index your columns. You can index up to 20 columns. Every column that you indexed, and if you perform a query on this, even though your list spans beyond 5,000 items, the query will be successful because you've created an index associated with that column. So in this case, if I want to create an index for activity date, all I need to do is just pick that column and create an index. Of course, my use case right now just had 4 items in there, so this should not be a problem. But that's a good question. If your list spans beyond 5,000 items, you need to make sure that you are indexing those columns.
And Reza, isn't there, if you look at the flow on that particular activity, does that information icon or the ellipsis give you some settings related to the list?
Yes, so if you go to settings, these settings are not related to the list. These settings are related to Microsoft Flow. So if you look at this, I can enable pagination out here. I can define an asynchronous pattern, decompression. There are different properties, but none of this is associated with the data source at the back end, right? All of this is purely related to my flow. Yes, I can define a threshold of the number of items that comes back. There is a difference between items that are returned by my query, and there's a difference between query that I'm performing. When I perform a query, I'm defining a filter operation. In that case, if my SharePoint list is beyond 5,000 items and that column is not indexed, it will throw an error. In SharePoint itself, you can keep flow aside. If you just go and execute a regular query, execute it through PowerShell, you can try it out. If that column is not indexed, you will get the 5,000 threshold limit error. In Microsoft Flow, the concept is the same. That query, if it has to be performed, the underlying data source has to be able to execute that query. Now, once that query is executed, this is the number of items that Flow can handle. If you have a standard Microsoft Flow license, it can handle up to 5,000 items. So if I was to perform a query and I know that the number of items after the query is performed is going to be greater than 5,000, then in that case, I would have to do a looping operation where I only get 5,000 items in batches. So I can perform operations on them because the threshold limit is 5,000. How do I know all of this? Again, very, very simple. If you go back to your Microsoft Flow, if you look at the action, if you go to more information and click on this, this will give you all the information about the SharePoint connector, the threshold, and so on and so forth, right? All of that information is available right here. So back to the 2 questions that were raised. Number 1 is what happens to items above 5,000 when you're querying? Because I'm querying this column, and if my list is above 5,000, I have to ensure that activity date is an indexed column. That's number 1. Number 2, If I know that the amount of data that's going to be returned in flow is going to be beyond that standard threshold that's defined for this particular action, I need to perform this operation in batches and I need to set a threshold based on the limit. The limit I believe is 5,000 for this. How can I increase the limit? You would need a plan 1 or a plan 2 license associated with flow. I believe it can handle up to, again, I'm just sticking my neck out. I might not, I'm not too sure. I think it's 100,000 items it can read. So it depends on your license. Your threshold keeps changing.
Thanks, Reza.
Most welcome. So this is my flow wherein I have a get items action, wherein I'm saying get me all the data where the activity date there's some activity performed in the last 7 days. Now, if I go back to my list, if you note, there's no activity performed in the last 7 days. So just for the sake of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit an item and I am going to change the last activity date for this particular item to today is September 4th. Let's say I make this September 3rd and I save this. Again, the concept, I'm just trying to explain the concept of the query in this case. So as you can see in my list right now, only Europe has the last activity date within the last 7 days, right? Today's the 4th. So if I take the last 7 days, that's probably 27, 28th of August. None of these are in that range except Europe. So that's my query. That's the first query I performed. After this, what I've done is I've used another function right here, an expression called length. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to make a check that does this SharePoint list have any region where the activity has been performed in the last 7 days. So I'm created a condition. Now, in order for me to understand if an activity has been performed or not, if this query returns me at least one item, I know that there has been some activity performed. If not, if I get 0 items, that means no activity has been performed. So again, when I create the condition, I'm using an expression. I am using an expression called length, right? Let's delete this and let's rewrite this expression. So I'm going to go ahead, kill this expression and rewrite this expression. So I'm going to say length. And as you can see, length is asking for a collection. The get items action related to SharePoint always returns a collection. Even though it returns 0 items, it will be an array. And I'll show you when I execute this. So now it's expecting the collection. If I switch to dynamic content, you see the get items action is giving me the list of items. So I'm going to just pick this and say OK. And that's it. That's my expression. It's just checking to see if this has the length is greater than 1. OK. If it is, actually it should be greater than 0. If it is, then in that case, I'm going to say activity present. If not, no activity is present. Again, I'm just printing data right now, but think about a use case wherein you want to query data from a data source. You want to check to see if certain conditions are met. And based on that, you want to send an email, or based on that, you want to perform some other operation flow. You could use this particular expression. Now let's go ahead and test this flow. So if I run this flow right now, if I execute this flow right now, let's look at the different steps that are performed. The first query is get items. And in this case, as you can see, the value that's returned is an array. And how do I know this is an array? If you look at the body of the response, there's this square braces that tells me it's returning an array to me. So it's returning an array with all the data from that SharePoint list. The next step, I also wrote a simple compose operation, which is telling me get me the length of this. And as you can see, the length is 1. And how did we get 1? Well, that's because in this list, I only have one item that has some activity performed in the last 7 days, because this is the date that I just changed. If I go back to flow and if I look at the condition now, the condition is right here. The condition was, is this length greater than 0? Because the length is 1, the flow checked that condition and it was true. Because it is true, it went into the yes part of my flow. And out here, I just printed the word activity present. So a very simple flow actually, which is just explaining where you can use expressions, right? I use the expression in an action right here because I wanted to query data. And I also used expressions in a condition because I wanted to check that the response that's coming back has data or not. Any questions on this? Okay.
Let me check the chat. Nope.
All right. The next part of my demo is around, so we are at 7:15. I had other demos around, very, very basic demos on string and collections and all that stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at more complex or real world scenarios at least. So now in this case, what I'm going to demo is sorting arrays with Microsoft Flow. Okay. Now, many a times you will come across scenarios wherein you've queried data from a particular data source and the response is an array. So for example, SharePoint, right? We just queried the SharePoint list. I got a collection as a response. I got an array as a response. Now, in this case, how do I create a flow that gets data from a data source? In this case, I'm hard coding. As you can see, I've created a variable. I've created an array out here. And this array has numbers in it, random numbers that I threw in 1, 5, 4, 7, 2, 8. Just randomly, I just threw in numbers. Now, what if I want to sort this in flow? There is no operation. There's no action in flow that says sort, right? If I go to actions and if I type the word sort, there's nothing, right? This is some third party connector that has probably the word sort in it, but there's no sorting action in flow. If you go to expressions, there is no default action in flow for sorting. Okay, there's nothing that tells you, okay, I want to sort my data. There's nothing available. So how do we do this, right? In this case, what I'm doing is I have a very simple array that I hard coded as part of this demo. The next step, again, I have another array that I created, which is an empty array. So two variables, right? First variable, which I filled in with values. Second variable, which is an empty array. Two simple arrays. Next step, I am using a loop, a for loop in Microsoft Flow. And when you loop, you have to loop on collections. In my case, the initial array that I created has the name ARR associated with it. And that's what I'm using right here. I'm using the variable ARR right here. So I'm using apply to each, right? This is my for each loop. And in this for each loop, I have some logic that is going to actually go ahead and sort this array. And finally, I am just printing out the sorted array variable. So before we look at how the flow has been constructed, how the expressions have been written, let's execute this flow, right? So this flow is running right now. It got the initial array that I created. It got the sort array that I initialized as empty. And then I have logic out here that's defined to sort the array. And finally, if you look at the output, this has sorted the array for me, right? It sorted the numbers from small to big. 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, random numbers that I threw in. Now, how did this take place? If we edit this flow and if we look at the different actions in the loop, this will guide us through the process. So the first one is something called as current item. You see current item. Now, how did I get current item? What is current item? I'm going to kill this. Under expression and dynamic content, if you notice apply to each, there's an option called current item. What this gives me is when this loop is running, which is the current item it is running for, right? So in this case, current item is going to directly give me that value. So I can either get it using this, or you can also write an expression for this, and the expression is item. Very, very simple. The expression is item. Both current item and item will return the same thing. And I'll execute this flow and show you how it returns the same value. Okay. So this is the current item in for loop. This is just text that I'm putting in a simple compose operation. This is just to prove what what is being executed. The next step, what I'm using is I'm using an action and flow called filter. It's a filter action. Okay. And what I'm doing is I'm filtering the sorted array. And you will ask this question, the sorted array is empty. That's okay. It gets populated later and this is running in a loop. So I'll explain this. But if you look at the sorted array, I am saying is filter the sorted array where item, again, I'm using the expression item, is less than or equal to the current item. Now in this case, current item and item, both of them are used in the context of the for loop. If you see, apply to each, it's a for loop. In this case, I am using a filter operation. So in this case, if I use item, this item is going to be in the context of the from array that's being executed. So in this case, item relates to the value in the sorted array and this item relates to the value that is currently running in the for loop. Okay, so all I'm checking to see here is that this current item in question is the value less than or equal to anything in the sorted array, or is the value greater than or equal to the sorted array. And finally, I am using another function called union, which enables me to combine multiple collections together. Now, if I run this and we will look at the actual flow in action, we'll go through step by step and you'll see how the array is being sorted. So if I run this, right, if I execute this flow, and it's going to take a minute, it's pretty quick. There you go. Now let's look at this for loop, right? So the for loop started. The first step, it's getting me the current item in the for loop. If you look at the array, the initial array that we created, the first item is the value 1. And that's exactly what it's got here, the value 1. Okay. Next step, what I did is I said filter and check to see if this value 1 is less than the collection of the sorted array. Of course, the sorted array is empty on step 1. So this is going to be empty. It's not going to give me anything. It's not going to filter anything. Same way for this, right? It's going to be empty. The first for loop action is going to be empty. Then I use something called as union. And in union, what I'm doing is I'm combining all of them together, right? I'm combining the the filter less than array. I'm combining the current item and I'm combining the filter greater than array. So in this case, I got the value 1 and I'm setting that value in the sorted array. Very simple. First step, just get the first value, just put it in the array. Step number 2, what happens in the second case of the loop? In this case, it got the value 5. How did it get the value 5? That's because the second number in my array is 5. Now let's understand the process. I use the filter operation and I check to see if this number is less than that sorted array. So is 5 less than 1? No. That means the output would still be the number 1. So if you look at the output, it's still the number 1. Next, is 5 greater than 1? The answer is yes, right? So if I edit this, if you look at the function right here, what I'm checking out here, I'm checking to see, is this item less than or equal to the current item? Is this item greater than or equal to the current item? So it's just a comparison check that I'm doing to give me the arrays. And finally, I am just doing a union operation to combine all of them together. That's why when my flow executes, it actually goes and checks to see, is it greater, is it lower? And based on that, as the for loop keeps running, so for example, if I go to the third item, in this case, the number is 4. If you look at the sorted array, it sorted them 1, 5, 4. And this keeps going on, keeps going on, keeps going on, and it keeps sorting the array. Now, in order for me to do all of this operations using Microsoft Flow, there are no direct actions for me. I have to understand expressions in order to do this. And where did I use expressions? If you look at my apply to each statement, I use the item expression value here to get the current item in context, right? If I, so that's one example. Yes, this is a simple array of numbers, no problem. You might have an array of objects, right? Maybe I have an array which says ID is 28. This is a JSON, of course. Title is Sweden, ID 56, title USA. So I have an array of countries and there is an ID associated with each country. Again, I want to sort this array based on the ID numbers. So basically I want to just sort this out. How do I do it? Exactly the same steps. I have my apply to each, I have my filter less than, and this time, instead of, because it's an object, if I want to fetch the value of my object, if you notice the function right here, I'll just write the expression for you. So normally I do item. So item will give me the entire item. In this case, it will give me this. But I just want the ID. So how do I get the ID? I'm going to go back to my expression. And in this case, I'll explain what question mark is later. This is ID, right? So if I hover on this, this is telling me that for the current item, get the ID property. Same step is right here. For the current item, get the ID property. So basically, I am looping through the array of objects, and then for each object, I'm getting its associated property. If I run this flow, and I know this is a little bit, this might be a little bit complicated, but the more you play with expressions, the more simple this gets, right? So I have an array of objects right here, which is IDs and the title, which is the country. finally, if you look at the output, it's giving me all the countries sorted, right? It's giving me India first. Why? Because it had the ID 9, which is the lowest, followed by the number 28, which is Sweden, followed by the number 56, United States, followed by the number 89, England. So this sorted the array, right? And if you look at the for each loop, when it is querying it, all those queries are running on the ID property within the current item. So once again, in order for me to execute this flow for sorting of objects, I had to use expressions. Any questions on these two demos, the sorting aspect of the array?
Nope, doesn't look like it.
Okay. And I will share all these flows with y'all as well. I'll add all of these flows to my GitHub repo. I think most of them are already there. So you can always go and extract those flows, import those flows into your environment, run those flows, and then look at them in action. Go change them, play with them. You'll understand them better. Okay, now we spoke about. Yes, please.
So I'm just trying to that would read the values, array, the items, the update item, goes sort of list.
So can you put this in, can you do something like that in the context of a SharePoint list where you would take either the ID value of the SharePoint list, or if you had a custom ID value, you could pull that data, you could pull data from the SharePoint list into the flow and then sort it the same way?
So this is my next demo, actually. It's exactly doing that. So as you can see in my next demo, I have a flow that gets triggered whenever a new item is created in a SharePoint list. Let's look at this list. So this is my.
Yeah, I think that would help with some contextual.
Sure. Absolutely. So great. I went to the wrong list. Let's look at the list in action here. So I have the site and I have a list called new students. So if I go to the site. All right. So I have a list of students, and in this, every time I create an item, right, it's asking me for title, which is mandatory. So let's say Nadal, Rafael, right? This is the format in which the names are added. And if I save this, I have a Microsoft flow that triggers the moment an item is created in this list. And what that flow does is it gets the first name and the last name from this string, and it will populate it back into the same list item. So if I refresh this, you see it picked the first name and it picked the last name. Now, how did this flow do this, right? How can I get this string and how can I get the information out from the string? And this is the flow that does it. So in this flow, I am saying this flow will trigger whenever an item is created. That's the trigger for my flow. I'm connecting to the site. I'm connecting to the SharePoint list. Very, very simple right now. Next thing, what I'm doing as part of my expressions, again, I'm using expressions. In this case, if you look at the update item action, I am updating the item in SharePoint. Okay. How did I get ID? How did I get title? Let me show you how did I do this. So for ID, it's asking me the ID of the item that I want to update. If you look at dynamic content, I have a trigger right on top which says whenever the item is created. In this trigger itself, I have the ID of the item in context, so I can just use it. Title is a mandatory field, so I have to refill it while I update the item. Again, I am just picking it from the dynamic content. But how did I get the first name and how did I get the last name, right? How did it go ahead and split it? Let's look at this. In flow, again, an expression. I used an expression. I'm trying to zoom in to show you this expression. I have an expression called split. And let's look at what split does. Okay. And I'm going to recreate this expression right from scratch. Okay, so here's an expression called split. And the first attribute that split wants is a text, right? Which is a string. So give me a string. Now in my case, if I go to dynamic content, the title is the string that I want to split. Okay, so how did I go to the title? Well, I just picked title. That's it, right? So I have split, trigger body, title. Now, how did I get trigger body, title? I didn't have to type that. All I had to do is in my split function, switch over to dynamic content, go and pick the dynamic content, and it automatically generates the expression for me. And if I go back to expression, I can continue writing my expression. So in this case, If I put a comma, it's asking me for the separator. So, okay, you want to split the string. What do you want to split it with? So in my case, I'm saying comma. Why comma? Because when I'm adding the name of my student, I am putting the last name, comma, and then I'm specifying the first name. Okay. So I'm splitting the string. When you split a string, yes, please.
Go ahead and finish, but my question is
Yes.
that if I'm passing a collection from Power Apps directly into a flow, my understanding the only way to do it is pass it as a string array and then split it in order to create the array in flow to be able to loop through it. Is there another way to be able to do that?
So this is true up until last month, but not anymore. And I have, again, I won't probably go through it, but if I go to my YouTube channel, I actually put this out. I have I have to look at the video in question. All right, so I have this video which talks about uploading multiple files from Power Apps to a SharePoint document library. And what I'm actually doing is I'm passing all the file information to a SharePoint document library using Microsoft Flow. And in that case, I'm not passing them as strings with a separator associated with it, but now you can actually pass JSON from Power Apps to Microsoft Flow. And this video will actually show you exactly how I do it. And I will share at the end of my presentation, I'll share you a link to my channel as well. So if you subscribe to this, you can also go ahead and look at all this content that I've provided. But you're right, up to a month, I believe a month and a half ago, you could only send strings, but now you can send other data types as well. Ultimately, it goes as strings, but it gets formatted as a different data type.
Cool, thank you. We do have another question.
Sorry,
Yes, please.
one step forward, it goes back to my original. So if you do that, you pass in a whole list as a JSON. Can you use your for each function to
Yes,
do them and put them in order?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
And that's exactly what I've done as part of. So if you look at this video, when I walk through it again, I'm just going to try and click and see if I get to the Microsoft Flow part. At least I show the flow. Actually, I have two videos, one which talks about, so this is the flow in question. Come on, get me the flow. So in this flow, I'm going to try and zoom in for you. As you can see, Power Apps is getting triggered. I get the JSON, I compose the JSON, I pass the JSON, and I run a for each loop, and then I upload each and every document into SharePoint.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, say that again.
So sorry, you did not hear that piece?
We lost you right at the end of that flow.
All right. So what I said is, if you look at that video that I shared, and again, I'll provide links to my YouTube channel and everything. If you look at that video, it will walk you step by step through how I created those items in SharePoint. And you're right, I did use a for each loop in which I passed through every item in that JSON object that I passed from Power Apps to Flow. And for each and every object that I got, I posted those documents over to SharePoint in a for loop. So those steps are clearly defined in that
Cool.
video.
Thank you. Anything else in the room? We're good, thank you.
All right. So in this case, I'm using the split function, and in that split function, I'm specifying the object that I want to split. So in my case, I am splitting the title attribute with comma. Now, the moment I do this, right, this will return to me an array. Okay. Why? Because how do I know that split returns an array, right? Another question. How do I know that split returns an array? If you look at the split function, if you look at the return type, which is probably right on, or if you go to the definition of split, it returns an array to you. Okay. And I have put a compose action right here. So when we run this flow, you look at the array that it generates. Next step, I want to put the first name and I want to put the last name. If you look at the last name function that I'm using, I'm again using split, which is exactly the thing I'm doing, right? I'm saying split the title by comma. So that's going to give me an array with two objects. How do I know this? Because that's the format in which my names are going in, right? The last name, comma, space, the first name. When I split it by comma, my array will have two objects, the one before the comma and the one after the comma. If I had multiple commas, I will have multiple elements in my array. In this case, my use case, I'm very sure I'm going to have two items in my array. Once again, expressions to the rescue. The split is going to give me the array. If I want to use the first element of my array, you see I have square braces and I've used the index position of the array. So I'm saying, give me the element in this array at position 0. And I'm splitting it by comma. So the moment I do this, the first element is the last name. And that's exactly what I'm putting in the last name field. And if you look at the first name field, I'm doing exactly the same thing. There is another function though called trim. I'll talk about this. But what I'm doing is I'm using split, same concept, but I'm using the index 1. Why am I using the index 1? Because this time I want the element sitting at position 1. Also in the element sitting at position 1, if you notice, I have a comma before the first name. I do not want that comma to show up in the first name field. So if I want to remove spaces, I'm sorry, it was a space, not a comma. If I want to remove the spaces, there is again a function called trim, which removes all the spaces. Now, if I was to show you the data for that previous run, right, when I added Rafael Nadal, if you look at this, when the item got created, my flow got called. If you look at the compose action, I used split on comma, right? If you notice, it created an array. And how do I know this is an array? Look at the square brackets. This is a collection. So it's giving me an array, a collection based on the split operation, which was comma. So I got two things. I got Nadal and I got space Rafael, right? And if you look at my update item action, if you notice the values that I populated based on those expressions, the first name is exactly the first name from the array and the last name is the last name on the position of the array. So once again, in order for me to perform certain operations, for example, get data, manipulate data, pre-populate data, all of that required me to play with expressions. I've used multiple expressions here. I've used split, I've used trim, I've used the concept of array, I've used the concept of parsing through the array using the index. Any questions on this one?
Nothing online. Anything in the room? Nothing in the room.
Okay, let's look at a more advanced flow. Now I know normally when I present this, I get a lot of questions, but the goal here is to understand expressions, not to understand this flow. Okay. Now I have a Microsoft flow. So everybody knows Alexa, right? Amazon Alexa, right? It's the voice tool that everybody uses. Now in my case, what I did is I created a Microsoft flow, right? And if you look at the trigger for my Microsoft flow, it's when an HTTP request is received. So it's an HTTP link that gets generated for me, an endpoint that I can call and my flow will get executed. Okay, anonymously. Anybody who calls this URL, of course, I'm not going to give you the entire URL, but if you get this entire URL and you actually execute this in the browser and you pass the associated schema that I have defined, this flow will get called. Okay, that's the concept of when an HTTP request is received. Now, I won't go into the dynamics of what this does, right? In the sense of what is the schema of this. So this is a flow that I have created, which gets called when this URL is called and a particular schema is posted. Then I have an action called get emails. This is again a Microsoft Flow action related to Outlook, wherein I'm saying get me the latest email in my inbox, right? And how do I know I want the latest email? I'm using one. Why? Give me the first email. Then the next step, what I'm using is I am sending a response back, right? You see response back to whom? The caller. So I'm sending a response back to the caller and I'm passing the response in a particular format that the caller expects. The goal here is not to understand the format of the response. The goal here is to show you how I'm using expressions. I'm using an expression for formatting the date and time. Why? Because I want the response to go in a nicely formatted date and time manner. Next, I'm using an expression to get you a value from an array. I just showed you this, right? This is going to give me an array of emails. I just want to read the first email, so I'm using the position 0. And I want to use an attribute from that object that's sitting in position 0, which is called from, right? Next step, I want the subject of the email. Again, I know it's only one email, so I'm using 0. And finally, I want to send the body of the email. So I'm using expressions. Again, I had to use expressions to get all of this data. Now, what does this flow do? In Alexa, I actually have a voice command that I can execute that actually goes ahead and calls this URL. Okay, it goes ahead, it calls this URL. This URL then gets executed. This flow gets executed. This flow then goes and gets me my latest email and then sends a response out. And this response is actually what Alexa reads out to me. So every day when I get up, if I want to know what's my latest email, all I need to do is tell Alexa to read me my latest email and this flow will get executed. Of course, I don't have the voice command available on my laptop, but I have the developer console for Alexa wherein I can actually call this flow. So let's do it right now. Ask Microsoft flow. So all
They
I
just
need,
added it to Windows 10 PC.
I know, but then when I try it, you won't hear. Can you guys hear
Oh.
what it's saying?
You dropped off and then you came back.
Okay. So it's actually reading the email out to me right now. Alexa, stop. All right. So basically what it is doing right now, as you can see, it went ahead, it called the flow. The flow in turn went ahead, performed the operations and sent the response back. If you look at my flow, and I'll show you how my flow got called. If you look at the flow run, it ran 35 seconds ago. That's when I executed that action. So if I click on this, if you notice, this is the response that I'm sending back, right? And the text response that I'm sending back, that I received an email at this date and this time from so and so user, and this is the details of the email. All of that is exactly what's being read out here. This is what Alexa will read out to me. So once again, in order for me to send data back in a particular format, for example, right, the number of days and this and that, I have to make sure that I'm using Microsoft Flow expressions. Okay.
Question.
Yes, please.
Do this with Cortana.
Yes, there is APIs available with Cortana as well, where you can actually, you'll have to understand the API format for Cortana and how you can execute a URL, how you can call a REST API endpoint. Yes, it's possible. Possible.
Cool.
So you can do this with Cortana, you can do this with Alexa, you can do this with Siri, you can do this with, as long as the API endpoint is available. Yes.
Cool. We do need to wrap up here in the next couple minutes.
Yes.
Does anybody have any final questions for Reza? Okay, and Reza, is there anything else you wanted to wrap
Yes,
up
please.
with?
I just wanted to complete the presentation. So I just have 2 more slides. I promise I won't take long. So
No
important to understand limitations around expressions. Again, these are just high limits like 131K characters or maximum number of characters per expression 8192. Once you start building really complex expressions, you'll be surprised to know that how many characters your expressions are. So you saw advanced expressions wherein I mix and match different expressions to perform different operations. That's the limit of the number of characters in an expression. So that's a limitation. That's it's a hard limit, but more or less assured you're never going to hit this. Next up is expression error messages are not too intuitive. So for example, if my expression was to error out for some reason, Flow is not going to tell me that, hey, you used specific, you used something incorrect. It's not too intuitive, right? You need to understand the function. That's why the IntelliSense and the help. Also, expressions do not save if the syntax is incorrect. So if for some reason, if I was to write an expression and my syntax is incorrect, and if I try to hit that OK button, it won't actually save. It will just continue to be there and it won't tell me where the syntax error is. So it's not intuitive enough to tell you that. So again, you need to be aware of the function. You need to be aware of its syntax. And yes, it's a learning curve. It's not something where I can just drag and drop things and say, hey, sort this array, or hey, format the date and UTC time, or compare these operations. They are not out of the box. You need to understand expressions. And this link is actually a link to all the functions that are available. Each and every function is right here. And you can go through this link and it will guide you through the process. Finally, best practices around expressions. Remember this, Microsoft Flow always reads and processes dates and times in UTC. So you need to make sure to convert them to your respective time zone. And we saw that as part of the demo. Always rename your actions with meaningful names. So whenever you add a new action in Flow, rename it, because later on you would be using them in expressions. So for example, compose, compose 1, compose 2, compose 3. Rename it to something useful, right? If you're composing something, what are you composing? Write about it. Add expression as comments to actions or conditions. So whenever you add an expression, you saw the expression window was too small. And if my expression grew beyond a point, I could not see what the expression is. So you can add them as a comment. That way is whenever you want to see what the expression behind it is, you can just look at the comment. Okay. And there are some other tips that I have defined here. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip a few of them right here. And finally, if you want to connect with me, if you want to ask more questions, that's my email ID. That's my Twitter handle. I'm very, very active on Twitter, extremely active. I might not respond to my email, but I'll respond to Twitter for sure. Very active on Twitter. That's my blog. That's my LinkedIn. And this is my YouTube channel where most of my Power Platform related stuff is available. So do subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'll make this presentation available in the Phoenix 365 LinkedIn user group. I have actually sent a request to join the group, Eric. So just add me and I will post this presentation in there.
I'll think about approving you.
Perfect.
And I think Reza's got about 59 YouTube subscribers, so let's increase that number for him as well. Thank you very much, Reza, for your time. Greatly appreciated. Any final thoughts or comments, questions for Reza?
Great job.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope this session was useful to all you guys.
I say yes. I think sounds to me like my own opinion. You guys tell me. Next session or a future session might be more of a Power Apps, a Flow 101 kind of a session where we start with the basics and then we'll see some of these expressions build up as well. That sounds good. Yeah, cool. All right. Great feedback, everybody. Thanks for attending. We'll get this posted out to YouTube ASAP. And with that, let's go ahead and